Thank you for being here. I'd like to take a moment to thank our sponsors, REACH, specifically the Race and Religion Board, and the Center for Faith and Vocation. In partnership with SGA, REACH is committed to promoting and embracing the diversity of race, spirituality, gender, sexual orientation, and viewpoints by fostering an open-minded environment for educational programs and campaigns, while being a support system for diversity organizations and other religious institutions. The Center for Faith and Vocation, more commonly known as Open House, is the Center for Religious Life on campus. It houses many different student religious organizations and also offers classes in yoga, monthly conversations, and study nights. The CFB is a space that welcomes people of all faiths and spiritual paths, as well as people who are not religiously affiliated. And I'm going to introduce our panelists. Thank you all for being here. Rabbi Aaron Spiegel works at the Center for Congregations, doing research consulting with congregations to enhance congregational effectiveness and efficiency. He also manages the Center's in-house information systems projects. Before relocating to Indianapolis in 1996, Aaron served several congregations in South Florida. A trans-denominational rabbi, he has a BA in comparative theology from the Union Institute and the University of Miami, Florida, a rabbinic ordination from the Rabbinical Academy of Musica Alex Lokovis, and a DMin in Congressional Studies from Harvard Seminary. He is the former board chair and CEO of Synagogue 3000, member of the Synagogue Studies Academy, and the campus rabbi for Butler University Hillel. Dr. James F. McGrath, not to be confused with Jim McGrath in athletics, is the Clarence L. Goodwin Chair in New Testament Language and Literature. In addition to teaching and researching in biblical studies, Dr. McGrath also works on projects such as religion and science fiction and religion and science. Last year, he taught a course connected with the public lecture series on religion and freedom of expression. Dr. Chad Bauman teaches about religion at Butler University. Since 2008, Professor Bauman has been conducting research on Hindu-Christian conflict and religious freedom in India, about which he has published a number of books and journal articles, the most recent of which just appeared in the Journal of Asian Studies. He is currently at work on 2 books on the topic. In addition to teaching and sharing his department at Butler University, Professor Bauman is currently working as a commissioned scholar of the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs at Georgetown University. Pastor Seth Miro attended Beloit College, double majoring in anthropology and religious studies. He received his MDiv from Concordia Theological Seminary in Fort Wayne, Indiana, majoring in systematic theology. He is currently working on an STM from CTS in liturgics and catechetics. Pastor Miro presently serves as parish pastor at St. Peter's Lutheran Church and campus pastor for LCMSU at Butler University and IUPUI. He married Nikki in 2004, and they have 3 children. Ms. Wasima Ali is the administrative director of the Desmond Tutu Center. Originally from Skokie, Illinois, she now calls Indianapolis, Indiana home. Wasima holds a Juris Doctorate degree from Valparaiso University School of Law and a bachelor's degree from Purdue University. Her past work includes strategic planning, nonprofit management, empowerment talks for victims of domestic violence, youth leadership workshops, and cultural sensitivity trainings for social workers and law enforcement personnel. Her previous engagements include the Muslim Alliance of Indiana, Amnesty International, Interfaith Youth Corps, and the Julian Center. She currently serves as an ambassador for Indie Reads, an adult literacy program, and PNC's World Group Initiative. She also sits on the board of directors for the Center for Interfaith Cooperation and the Peace Learning Center. Father Charles Allen, PhD, is an Episcopal priest and chaplain with Grace Unlimited, the Episcopal Lutheran campus ministry at Butler. He occasionally teaches courses in religion at Butler and also taught courses on interreligious dialogue at Christian Theological Seminary. So thank you all for being here. We have quite an impressive and diverse board. I wrote part of the First Amendment on board. I hope everyone can read it. I know my handwriting's not the best. But it states, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. This is only part of the First Amendment, but it's the part that we're going to be focusing on today. And it provides both freedom of and freedom from religion in the United States. I'm going to start off the discussion by addressing 3 big questions and giving each panelist 2 to 3 minutes to answer each question. After that, the floor will be open for questions from the audience and discussion. My first question. Religious rules concerning appearance and clothing often create controversy, testing the limits of religious freedom and societal security in a democracy. We hear stories of Muslim or Sikh inmates not allowed to grow a full beard for fear that they will hide something inside of it, of Jewish inmates not being allowed to wear a kippah or skull cap outside their cells, and of Muslim women not being allowed to wear headscarves or hijabs when they play sports. In this case, I would fear for their own safety. We know stories of people of any faith being discriminated against in the workplace for wearing anything that associates them with a particular faith. How do you define and analyze this type of discrimination? Is there a point at which security needs must supersede religious expression?
Wow. I don't need that. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay. The wearing of religious paraphernalia is a behavior associated with what one believes. Law, as defined by the Constitution and its amendments, does not grant the freedom, but protects the freedom already given. And so in that way, law always operates within the bounds of behavior. Law always checks behavior, whether that be your freedom to drive 80 miles an hour on the interstate, your freedom to possess selected amounts of a contraband drug, right, in certain states, not here. But the freedom always is protected by the barrier of the law, which acts as a curb. The question becomes, in the carrying out of behavior, I find it intriguing in the references made that all of them, well, two of them I should say, that were addressed, where one was a convict who was an inmate at a prison in Wyoming, if I remember the article correctly. The other is a military major. In different ways, but also similarly, both of these, one voluntarily, one involuntarily, restricts freedom. You submit yourself to a governing authority besides that of the U.S. Constitution and government, right? And so, to establish laws therein are actually both for the individual and for the community at large. I don't know, I guess I'd like to come back to the issue specifically, but the question that I would ask in response to it is, we are questioning the impingement of freedom upon those who are in correctional facilities for crimes they have committed. What about those who are living as free citizens, who their freedoms are being restricted simply because they own a business and choose not to sell to certain people? I don't know if that's too many.
Well, I'll use this at least for the benefit of recording, if for no other reason. Although I'm pretty sure I picked you up, so I wouldn't worry too much. Yeah, I approach this sort of with two hats. I'm a religion professor here, but I'm also connected with the faith tradition known as American Baptists, who were historically, well, most of the time today, strong proponents of the separation of church and state. The thinking being that state involvement in religion is bad for religion. Right? It gives people all sorts of ulterior motives for doing things. And so it's out of the mixture of academic interests and personal convictions that I approach subjects like this. I certainly agree with previous panelists that freedom of religion in our country and in any country is a trade-off. Right? There's no such thing as infinite freedom of religion. Inevitably, we decide that you cannot justify, let's say, child sacrifice, which is a historic religious practice. We decide to protect children, even though it infringes on the religious freedom of some people. And so there is always a balancing act that's being carried out between maximizing freedom for all in a way that also inevitably impacts the freedom of all. And really the question comes down to, right, it's not simply, is freedom of religion being respected or not in this case? It's always the question, whose religious freedom is being restricted, and what are the implications for others? And so there are religious practices or practices which are, at the very least, are motivated by religion, which may make others feel unsafe. And that can range from somebody who perhaps self-identifies as a conservative Christian, handing out, let's say, homophobic propaganda or something like that, to someone who is a Sikh and who carries the ceremonial dagger that their religion mandates that they should have. There are no simple answers where we say, oh, okay, we're going to have freedom of religion, and so now the problem's solved. It's always a question of how do we maximize freedom for people while also not infringing on the freedom of others. And that inevitably includes not just freedom of others to practice religion as well, but also the ability of people to feel safe. And part of the problem is that, particularly if you are a member of some group that is, statistically speaking, the majority in our country, it is often hard to realize when people who are not part of that majority, in some way, shape, or form, don't feel safe. And so, oftentimes people respond by objecting that their own religious freedom is being curtailed, when in actual fact, people who are more at risk because they're part of a minority are having their freedom defended. And so that doesn't give a short answer to the question that gives a quick resolution, but I hope it at least highlights what I think the central issue is in this kind of discussion.
Something kind of dainty about this microphone that makes it weird to hold, but
put your pinky up.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I think maybe we'll continue with Professor McGrath's comments in two directions. The one is to say, I think it's worth noting what's maybe obvious, and that is that it seems to quite regularly be the case that the practices that we find scary or worth prohibiting or curtailing in some way are practices of religious minorities, and in many cases when we're talking about the hijab or particular religious paraphernalia, to use the phrase that's always been used, it's the religious paraphernalia of minorities that we seem to be talking about curtailing, and I don't think that's accidental. And there's a long history in the United States of us taking 50 to 100 years to get used to religious minorities who we eventually declare to be quite normal after all, and it's happened with Catholics and Mormons and Jews, and maybe Muslims are in the midst of that process today. So I think that's one issue. The other thing I would say is that we have to get away from the assumption that a secular state is neutral on religious affairs. It's simply not, as Professor McGrath was implying. When the government decides that certain kinds of religious behaviors are acceptable and certain are not, it's defining religion implicitly, whether it wants to be defining religion or not. It's saying what is good religion and what is bad religion, what's acceptable religion, what's not acceptable religion. And so when we are saying that certain people can wear certain kinds of things and other people can't wear them, whether it's in the workplace or out in public, we are basically making declarations as a nation about what is good and acceptable religion. And other nations work with different kinds of definitions of religion and end up making different sorts of declarations about this very same things. And then as a religious studies scholar, I think I feel the need to point out that we're talking here not just about the law, but really at heart about how we define religion, and that informs the law from the very start.
Thank you, Dr. Bowden.
Can you guys hear me? So I don't know if this is because of my training, but I would have to approach this from this reading, the literal reading of the issue at hand, which is a free exercise part of the problem. So the situation here is that the law is not, the government or the perpetuator of this law is not establishing a religion, but rather limiting the free exercise of a religion. And because that is the case, the court will use a different test that includes the study of what is the intention behind why that law was set forth. There's usually a study done as of whether or not the law is facially neutral. So does it discriminate right off the bat, or is it facially neutral but has a more discriminatory purpose behind is that it depends. It depends whether or not there is discrimination on behalf of the body that is, issuing the law. Something that stood out to me when we were talking about the article, and that we were talking about the individuals that were incarcerated. Well, when you're incarcerated, unfortunately, you are kind of deprived of a lot of your rights. For instance, voting is one of our most fundamental rights. But once you've been incarcerated, that you lose that right to vote. And so, within that, I think the courts, and then again, because if you are talking about a suspect class, which is a group of individuals that a suspect class would be if you're being discriminated against because of your religion, your nationality, your race, immutable traits that you cannot change. And that would give you, the court has to use the highest level of scrutiny when that is the case. And what that means is that the government, or usually it's the government, has to show that there is a very compelling government interest that is is narrowly tailored to satisfy the government's interest. So with that being the case, if we exercise, we are looking at strict scrutiny. And then, I think it depends. But once again, if you're looking at, for instance, one of the cases we looked at was in regards to a woman who covers her hair from the Muslim faith not being able to play basketball because she covers her hair. And I think that's interesting because as a Muslim woman, we look at countries like Saudi Arabia and we say, oh, it's unfair that women cannot play sports because there's a law that says maybe women should not play sports. But at the same time, we kind of have similar laws in the books that discriminate certain women from playing certain sports. So I think it really depends on what is the intention behind the law, and was it something that was adopted because of or in spite of the oppression practiced in
I do think that James already discussed how, in a sense, the First Amendment sets up a tension because you can't establish a religion and you can't prohibit its free exercise. And it's important to remember that the First Amendment goes on that these are not the only rights or the only liberties covered in the First Amendment. There's freedom of speech, and freedom of press, and freedom of assembly. All of which, too, I think, sort of feed into, it's a freedom of expression issue and not simply free exercise of religion when we're talking about can you wear a head covering. I'd like to broaden it to say, at what point do we establish dress codes for anyone legally? Or say you can't have a tattoo, or you can't, and whether you have to have a religious justification for doing it, or is it simply a matter of conscience? I might be wrong about this, but I believe there were earlier drafts of the Bill of Rights that actually had the word conscience in a draft of the First Amendment, and it's supposed to be conscience, which broadens it beyond established religions or recognized religions. But somehow that dropped out in the version of the past. There are countries that do forbid wearing head coverings, even oddly enough. I don't know how many of you know that the Turkish government is a very secular government, and they have begun barely to tolerate wearing a head covering. There was a time, just a few years ago, when a woman could not attend the university if she insisted on wearing a head covering. I think that has been eased lately, but that doesn't come up in our country. As obvious, there are issues like on the sports team or something like that, but it's a different model of disestablishment. It's almost as if it says religion must be as invisible as possible, and we have opted in this country, at least in theory, it's more of a matter of whether we can be consistent about saying, yes, the freedom of religious expression is protected by the Constitution. But again, it's sort of, it might depend on what somebody insists is a freedom of religious expression. so glad I get to go last. I had no idea what I was going to say. So I'm going to take a different tack. I'm thinking of this more in a psychological or sociological perspective. We, meaning American society, tend to lump things together. I think that's a societal norm. So if we have this constitutional amendment that says what it says, we try to lump everybody into one basket. Well, it doesn't work. It doesn't work. As folks have said beforehand, I see a direct, almost a contradiction in those two precepts. You can't form a religion, but you can't keep people from expressing it. And I don't think either of them works. If it comes to an issue of safety, I don't think it's a question. Although we're Americans, we have choice. One of the choices we have is we can argue about things. Certainly from my tradition, that's how we figure stuff out. But safety always comes first. If it's not a safety issue, is it a religious expression issue, or is it a personal expression of something else? And the reason I say this is I've talked to more than a few Jewish men, for instance. I don't wear a kippah all the time. And I'm always interested about men who wear them who are not Orthodox, who are not strict followers of Jewish law. And I'm going to generalize, but no one's given me a satisfactory answer yet why they do that. It's generally a statement. And this came up in the reading for me, and the young woman who can't play basketball because she's decided to wear a hijab now. Well, in her previous, before she got to college, or maybe in college, she didn't wear it. What's changed between now and wanting to play professional basketball? That she's made the choice to wear that headscarf, which is also a choice not to participate in this basketball. So, to me, it's not as much a societal issue as it is an individual issue. Again, I'll stress, if it's a safety matter, I did find it interesting, the Sikh, one of the reasons the armed forces said that Sikhs can't have long beards and long hair is because they're worried it was going to get caught up in the machines. That's bizarre. But if that's really the determination, then the armed forces has every right to make this determination. And then if you choose not to follow that precept, you're choosing not to be able to participate in the U.S. Armed Forces.
Thank you, Rabbi Siegel. I'll move on to my second question now. The Obama administration's Affordable Care Act has been controversial on many fronts. I'd like to focus on the so-called Hobby Lobby decision. On June 30th, 2014, the Supreme Court ruled by a 5-4 vote that corporations with religious objections to some forms of contraception would not be required to provide coverage for contraception. This case has affected many women who thought that under the ACA they would have access to affordable contraceptives. Such contraceptives are not uniquely prescribed in the interest of avoiding unwanted pregnancies, but in many cases for medical reasons. What is your opinion of the Supreme Court ruling, and do corporations affiliated with religious groups have the right to refuse access to contraceptives to all of their employees on religious grounds or not?
Hold this microphone on. No, it's okay. No, I just don't do well with mics. This is an absolutely touchy one. Gosh. To begin with a quote from "Oh Brother, Where Art Thou?" In reading the article from the New York Times on this subject, the personal rancor detected in that article I do not intend to dignify with comment. But I would like to address the hopeless negativism in general. Meaning Life begins at conception. That's not a religious principle. It's science. The value one places on that life is determined by morality, ethics, religion. Hobby Lobby, for instance, was one of over 100 cases on this very issue, Affordable Care Act, requiring 20 different forms of contraception, 4 of which are deemed to be abortifacients. They cause death in the womb to already conceived life. The free expression of religion cannot be infringed upon by the federal government. In this case, Hobby Lobby, a closely held public company, doesn't have a board of directors, right? Doesn't trade on the New York Stock Exchange. Falls not only within the purview of the First Amendment and what is known as the RFRA, Religious Freedom Restoration Act, but also within the purview of corporations. That they can act in this manner, already established by legal guidelines. They are not limiting in any way the availability of these forms of contraception, these 4 forms. Their healthcare covers the other 16 forms of birth control. These particular 4 that are abortifacients, they refuse to cover. They're not limiting their employees' access to these things or saying that female employees can't use them. They're simply saying, we won't pay for them because we deem them to be killing of life. That is a freedom of religious expression that is allowed not only by the Constitution and amendments, but by the religious or by corporation acknowledgement. Ultimately, the decision made was not one to limit the access or limit the freedom of women, but rather it was the Supreme Court upholding religious freedom in the United States. And that decision affected not only Hobby Lobby, but numerous other corporations.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Well, I think this is the first time I'm responding to someone I disagree with almost every single point. It hasn't happened to me before, but see what I do with it. I disagree that science says that life begins at conception. Life is there prior to conception. If you're talking about life, I mean, a sperm is alive and an egg is alive. And if we're talking about the start of human personhood, then that's hotly disputed. But it's not clear that science can define a fertilized ovum as a person. But if one decides to do so, it's doing something beyond what science can say. That's my take on that particular matter, which I thought it appropriate to address by way of sort of the presuppositions. As far as the Hobby Lobby case is concerned, I mean, it seems to me that this is a clear case where the question is between the religious freedom, if we want to call it that, and we think it deserves to be called that, of the employer versus the religious freedom of the employee. In my own opinion, not everyone would accept this, but in my own opinion, healthcare, my own opinion is that healthcare ought to be taken, ought to be nationalized, and then we take it out of this whole disputed area with employers having to provide it, and that might solve the problem. But if we don't want to go that route, then healthcare is part of the remuneration package that an employer gives to an employee. And just as we consider it inappropriately restrictive if an employer paid someone their salary in some sort of debit card that could not be used to buy things that they considered appropriate, whether it was pork or pornography, or you can come up with your own list of what you think someone might want to restrict their employees purchasing with money that they pay them. Ultimately, we consider that employees have the freedom to do what their own conscience deems appropriate with the remuneration they receive, even if their employer doesn't. So it's a question of whether an employer has the freedom, if we want to call it that, to restrict access to health care that the government has deemed that people ought to have access to. And so there, I would want to err on the side of maximizing freedom for the individual employees. And that seems to me to be the choice that I would make if I were deciding a case of that sort. I think I've probably used up my time, and so I will pass the microphone along.
Thank you, Dr. McGrath.
I'm still waiting for the India question. But I'll deal with the United States if I'm forced to. I guess my take on this has to do with the possibility here of slippery slopes. When we're dealing with something like healthcare, I think it's useful to pay attention to what the scientific community might say is best for us as a society, and try to be guided by that as much as possible. Obviously, there's disputes within that community as well, and there's no consensus. The problem is that as soon as we begin making certain kinds of exceptions, we have the difficulty of knowing when to stop. So Hobby Lobby has this particular objection. What about the religious people who believe that it's more or less a sign of one's disbelief if one takes any kind of health care? If they govern a large corporation, are they allowed to wriggle themselves out of offering health care altogether? Well, no. We say no. Why? What's the distinction? And here's again where we're getting into the question of, we consider this one objection about abortion to somehow be a legitimate objection, and this other equally religious objection to be an illegitimate objection. Why? On what basis do we make that distinction? I don't think there's any very clear way for a government to make that distinction, which is why I think making distinctions in the first place and making certain kinds of concessions to certain sorts of religious people is not necessarily something we should never do, but something we have to do very carefully. And this comes from somebody who grew up Mennonite in a community where the entire community had a concession from the government in the form of an exemption from military service. So I certainly, in some ways, through my own experiences, know both sides of this coin, but I've come to find it somewhat problematic that we would too easily give exemptions from certain kinds of general laws, because I think it becomes difficult to determine where to stop.
Thank you, Dr. Baumann.
Stop there.
So reading, so it's on now. So reading this, I was a little bit, I would want to say conflicted, but at the same time I feel I kind of keep religion out of it and look at it more from a legal point of view. And with that being said, I think a lot of it had to do with, my take on this was that, in Citizens United, we established entities as having pretty much human traits. And so if, for instance, if this was an individual saying, I don't want to give funding to this kind of, like an abortion clinic, that's different, as opposed to a whole corporation saying, we're going to not provide this type of coverage to a large group of people because we find a problem with what's required of us. And so there's the whole corporation is taking making a decision based on its personal beliefs, essentially, which it's an extension of humans, obviously, because there's humans behind this corporate entity, but the action is moving forward under the corporate realm. And so on that note, I think the fact that you did have 20 so different techniques that were looked at, and 4 they found problematic, and those were the 4 that they didn't have to provide coverage on, seemed somewhat fair, if that's what we're going to get at. I would agree with the point, which is it should be, at the end of the day, up to the individual, and I do think that contraception is something that should be covered, but at the same time we are looking at our law, our country, and we do provide certain protections when it comes to freedom of religion. And so because of that, I think, once again, similarly as the court would look at the sincerity of a belief of an individual, it was similar study there. Was this a sincere belief on behalf of Hobby Lobby? So.
Thank you, Ms. Levin.
Well, I hate going after James McGrath because he usually says what I was going to say. I do think that, again, it's not, science does not establish when human life in a morally relevant sense begins. That's a much more complicated question. With cloning technology, every single cell in my body is a potential human life. So does that mean I can't clip my fingernails? I mean, but the other thing is, it does seem to me to be a conflict. I mean, I realize the Supreme Court has upheld a long-standing tradition in America that treats corporations as if they were people. You know, just philosophically, I have to say that's bullshit. But the Supreme Court hasn't. You know, we have to go with what the Supreme Court decides right now. And hope. I mean, you know, the Supreme Court said back in the 80s, they even quoted the Bible and said, you know, that homosexuality had to be illegal because every traditional society was against it, which I thought, again, well, what does that have to do with the Constitution? But, and now it seems to have reversed itself pretty much on that. You know, but there is this conflict between the rights of the individual. Again, my church, for example, does not, will take a stand against legal regulation around the question of abortion. So it's in a sense, if somebody from my church wants health care and this company doesn't provide it, then they are infringing on the rights of a member of my church. If someone, for other conscientious reasons, believes that they are not taking a human life, and again, I think this is an ethical. This could be debated in ethical terms, but I don't think science is going to decide it one way or the other. They're not. I mean, their moral and religious convictions are not being respected. So anyway, I mean, I recognize part of what they said. I understand the bit about somebody owning a business having certain strong convictions about things, but the more public that business becomes, the more other people's livelihoods depend on that business. It seems to me that, at least ethically speaking, there are obligations to respect the diversity of other people who are the employees.
Thank you, Brother Charles.
If I put this down here, can you hear me? Great. I'll hold that thing. So I want to contextualize my remarks to be very clear that Judaism does not consider life beginning at conception. Very clear about that. There is the potential for life, but until, and this is debated, but really until the baby crowns, it's part of the mother's body. So for me, you know, it's almost a non-decision to say to a woman that she can't do with her body what she wishes it's not only antithetical to my tradition, it's antithetical to being an American. So that's my context. I also want to lift up something Dr. McGrath said, that I think healthcare should be a right of us as a citizen of the United States. That we're the only developed country and some non-developed country in the world where it's not is bizarre to me. I just don't get it. But that's beside the point. So now I'm going to really surprise you that because we've chosen to be this way, I think Hobby Lobby has every right to say we're not going to cover this. I think it's a stupid thing to do, and I think it makes them look really stupid, but we have it set up in this country that we've given them the right to do that. So I think coming at this from the Supreme Court to make this change is sort of backwards. In my perspective, we should be going at this from the fundamental right of us as Americans of having some semblance of health care that we don't have to depend on the whims and the religious peculiarities of our employers. I'm not optimistic that that's going to happen, but you know, in a perfect world, we could have a perfect system. I do have, again, though, the power of choice. I can choose not to shop at Hobby Lobby. And I can choose to tell as many people as I know not to shop at Hobby Lobby and why I think they shouldn't go there. I think as a company, they are disrespectful and treating their workers inhumanely. I'd go that far. That's, you know, if we're going to function totally on a corporate system, that's the way I think that we can make a difference. It's like, I don't shop at Walmart because of the way they treat their employees. Don't shop at Walmart.
Thank you, Rabbi Siegel. I'll now go to our final question before we open the floor for questions from the audience. On September 18, 2014, a panel of advocates spoke before Congress stating that the State Department had not done enough to protect religious freedom on the international scale. Minority religions are being persecuted throughout the world, but according to Utah Republican Jason Chaffetz, quote, religious freedom has long been neglected as part of the United States human rights agenda, unquote. Do you believe that the United States should play a role in the protection of religious freedom throughout the world? Why or why not?
Sure. To what extent? I don't know. It's not part of our governing system does not exist outside of our borders. You can't push that upon other countries. Defense of religious freedom for some in the United States, as we have defined it, meaning some, meaning Americans, all U.S. citizens, should it extend globally? Yes. What role does the U.S. play in that? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know how we would determine that, except perhaps on a case-by-case basis, recognizing that simultaneously, as while we are defending religious freedom around the world, we are not forcing democracy in some way, shape, or form upon other countries if that is not their wish. Got a lot of in-house problems. Whether or not we expand the, other nations and try to correct their issues before our own is another question. That's my non-answer.
Thank you, Pastor Aaron.
At this time, I'm going to largely agree. I think, there definitely does seem to be a pattern that we care about minorities more if they live, let's say, someplace that has oil or something like that. Our involvement in world affairs is selective. It's not consistent. I would definitely like our country to be a voice for religious freedom around the world. But there are limits to the ways that we can appropriately get involved, other than being a voice, perhaps boycotting or refusing to trade or doing other things that have been pointed out we can do individually, but we can also do as a nation in relation to other nations. As a sort of aside in relation to my most direct connection with this, I actually do research on a religious minority and its traditions and texts known as the Mandaeans, who are historically located around where the border between Iraq and Iran is, and found historically on both sides. And they found themselves driven out of their homes and as refugees a lot of the time, as have the Yazidis who've been on the news, I think, a little bit more than the Mandaeans have. And so there is something that can be lost if nothing is done. This is the last surviving Gnostic group that has survived from ancient times down to the present day. They are a fascinating group, a fascinating tradition, and it's in danger of disappearing. And so I think we'd all agree that something needs to be done. But just as it's challenging to navigate the relationship between individual freedom and corporate freedom, between freedom of expression and preservation of safety, it's difficult to navigate the waters between taking a stand for something that we think is important and not inappropriately and imperialistically trying to directly force our will on others. That's my knowledge.
Thank you, Dr. McGrath.
think one of the issues that I think about when I think about this is that we are compromised in our ability to speak for religious freedom by what has already been mentioned, and that is that we haven't been terribly consistent in our own context. This reminds me of our fierce advocacy for the rights of homosexuals around the world, which we came to only 5 minutes after we ourselves made certain kinds of formerly considered aberrant sexual behavior illegal. So and now we are sort of condemning others who haven't come to this 1 minute after we did. So there's something similar going on, I think, with religious freedom. We have this myth of being a nation founded on religious freedom, and we were a nation founded on people who wanted religious freedom, but often freedom for themselves and not for their neighbors. And our colonies were frequently sort of anti-Catholic or anti-Protestant, and all of them were sort of anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim at one time or another. So we have this history that's a little mixed, and it makes it difficult for us to be advocates, I think, for religious freedom. And the other thing I would say is I'm sort of two minds about all this. On the one hand, I spend a lot of time with people like Thomas Farr, who's a former member of the State Department who now lobbies the government for issues of religious freedom. And he's somebody I frequently argue with because his advocacy often seems to focus on Christians. And as someone who studies reactions in India to what we as Americans do quite regularly, I find myself on the other side of this issue, not on Thomas Farr's, even though I agree that the religious freedoms of all religious people ought to be defended. When you look at the actions of America from the perspective, for example, of India, you see things differently. Indians and many people around the world often perceive the United States advocacy for religious freedom as an advocacy for the religious freedom of Christians. And Hindus in America have pointed out that until very recently, the voices of Hindus were not even sort of considered on USERF, the United States board that sort of advocates for religious freedom around the world. This is a largely Christian body working with largely Christian and to some extent Jewish sorts of assumptions. And so you have unintended consequences. Basically, when America starts sort of preaching religious freedom around the world, it often provokes a kind of backlash, a sort of defensive backlash that says, well, you don't have things perfect in America, right? You don't have your house perfectly in order either. There's lots of hate crimes against Jews and Muslims and others in the United States every year. And so how can you come preaching to us? And it creates almost a negative environment for the discussion of religious freedom that I think in some ways undermines it around the world. And so I think that's why I'm of two minds. I think that we ought to be advocating for religious freedom, but I think because of our complicated role in global affairs as Americans, our preaching often has unintended and unexpected effects.
Dr. Bell?
I would like to reiterate Chad's point, pretty much plagiarize what was inside, but it seems like our interventions usually, after our interventions, what comes up is usually not in our best interest, far removed from our best interest. And so in terms of intervention and advocating for religious freedom, it would really depend on what it looked like. I think whether it's from the academic setting and it's writing scholarly articles on, the benefits of freedom of expression and things like that is very different than saying that our government needs to adopt this mission of, advocating for religious freedom, which is hard to say because it's kind of contrary to what I believe, because I do believe religious freedom is kind of a trait that God's given each individual, and so it doesn't make any sense for other individuals to put any kind of, stipulations on whether you practice a religion, how you practice a religion, but in terms of whether or not our government should be doing that, I would say no because of history.
I would say too that I tend to be suspicious about when our government says it's going to do something to protect religious freedom, because, as James said, probably has to do with whether there's oil in that country or not. I'm more, there's the question of just how much of a police force should the U.S. be in the world anyway, and should the U.S. promote the civil liberties, among which is religious freedom? That I see as obviously yes, in realistic ways. I don't know. It occurred to me that you could say, if you just said that we should be, if we're going to stick with the First Amendment, which calls for the disestablishment of religions, does this mean we should invoke economic sanctions on England because they tax? I mean, their taxes go to support the Church of England. They have an established church. Should we do that with every religion that has established churches for every country? I mean, it's interesting to me that there are many countries, well, there are European countries where churches are established, and yet they are more publicly tolerant of religious diversity than some sections of the U.S. So it's not always clear to me that establishment or disestablishment is the same as whether religious freedom is respected or not.
Thank you for other draws.
So I think the question was, should we do more? My answer is no. Should we do nothing? No. I think it's fascinating. I happen to know Rabbi Saperstein. He's a brilliant guy, and he's the nominee for ambassador at large. And I don't know what he's thinking taking this. He must know something more than, certainly knows more than I do. But to me, this smacks of colonialism and imperialism, and the United States, this attitude that we collectively sometimes have that we know what's best for everyone, which is obviously not true. Our history bears that out. And I'm just going to echo what my colleagues have said. We need to model religious freedom before we force it down or offer it as something for others, because we don't do a very good job of it. I don't want to turn this into a political thing, but and this is very oxymoronic for me. Rabbi Saperstein is the potential ambassador at large, and the state of Israel is constantly criticized, is secular state, when it does anything around protecting it as a Jewish state. That's the one place in the world that seems to defy this religious protection piece. So I just had to throw that in there as an example that we're not clear what that means for us in this country. We have no business sticking our noses in other people's.
Thank you, Rabbi Spiegel. I would now like to open the floor for any questions you have. They can be directed to a specific member of the panel or to the panel at large. If there are any questions, go ahead.
I've been reading Locke, who says that our rights extend until they harm another person, which seems to me a good and also elusive rule of thumb. I'd like to ask you two guys at either end who've supported Hobby Lobby whether you think that a person's exercising medical rights that their employers don't like harms their employer, whether an employer withholding this particular form of medical care harms the employee, which would be a Lockean test. So that's the first part of the question. And then I wonder what you would say if Hobby Lobby, for the very same reasons of religious freedom, decided that it was entitled to fire employees who had an abortion, who supported abortion, or who voted for people who advocated abortion because it violated their religious principles. It's a great area. So first, is anyone being harmed in this? And second, would you extend the freedom to get rid of employees altogether?
Well, Can I start?
The last shall be first.
I don't support Hobby Lobby. I believe that they have the right to do this stupid thing. Let me be clear about that.
No,
Do I?
you were clear about that. Do
Yeah.
you feel that they have the rights to do the next stupid thing?
I do. And are they harming somebody? Yes. So, it is our laws that have set that up to be that way. I don't agree with it. And I don't want to take it to the next level because I agree with it, but our laws say that they can do that until we change the laws, or until the Supreme Court is clear. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm certainly not a constitutional scholar. It is, to me, unethical to the extreme. But we tend not to address ethics if it's not convenient. My great answer.
So that I may be clear, I do support Hobby Lobby. I don't believe their decision to be stupid, but rather well within their boundaries, both religiously and in terms of corporate identity. Does an individual check their religious beliefs at the door when they establish a business? Right? The question in terms of the First Amendment, the government continues to tighten the grip upon what is free expression of religion. Does it exist only within the boundaries of your worship setting, only within the closet in which you pray? Or does it have bearing on how you live your life? Right? This idea of you're entitled to believe whatever you want, just don't act upon it ever. That's ludicrous.
I was
Right?
asking a specific
And so,
question
yeah,
about
and so
harm.
addressing your question, do no harm. What about the harm done to the unborn child that is being killed in the womb by this abortifacient drug? Hobby Lobby is standing up for life. They are protecting the rights of the unborn. Do they have the right then to fire a woman because she has had an abortion, or fire a man because he has voted in favor of abortion? No, of course not.
Why not? They're the same. They're using their money to do the same thing. In fact, they may have done the same thing.
No, they haven't.
Yes, if you've committed abortion, you've harmed life.
Yes, but they have not, they, as a business, have not fired anyone for such action.
No, do you feel they have the right?
No, they
to
don't.
do
I
that?
don't feel they have the right, nor do they, I believe they have the right according to law.
No, they don't. I'm asking you an ethical question.
Yeah, and I
What
answer.
gray area?
I
So why is
I
it-
don't feel they have that right, nor do I believe they presently have that right.
Would you set out the difference between getting an abortifacient, which they don't wish to supply, and providing money to someone who's actually getting an abortion?
Sure, sure.
What's the difference?
If I can use the example of the other entity within that same case, because it was, for media purposes, it was labeled Hobby Lobby versus, but other entities were involved, including Little Sisters of the Poor, which is a non-for-profit Catholic organization where nuns offer care for the elderly poor. They too argue that within Catholic theology, any form of contraception is against their moral principles. So their argument was not only can we not participate in what we consider immoral, nor can we be complicit and send somebody to a place where we consider it to be immoral. Does that mean they won't take in a woman who had an abortion? Of course not. Does that mean Hobby Lobby is going to fire a woman who had an abortion? Of course not. What they are asking in the free expression of their religious purview is, I don't have to set my religious beliefs at the door, nor am I beholden to my employees to demand of me something that is against my conscience. I'd like to know what the doctor of jurisprudence has to do.
So it's interesting. I love to take it. No. So the abortion is they were acting within their rights. So they could, depriving the individuals of that specific type of contraceptive was their exercising of their right. However, if they were to fire an employee because they had an abortion, that's contract law. So they would, that's discrimination based off of my own belief. I can't fire somebody because I sincerely believe something different than them. But if I have a sincere belief, you can't stop me from practicing that sincere belief. So that's the relationship is a little bit different in terms of how the court will approach it.
What if Hobby Lobby were to argue, I don't want to give my money for the insurance, so it's an act of religious freedom. I don't want to give my money to somebody who is killing fetuses because it is against my religious expression. The nexus in both cases is paying money.
So this, first and foremost, I think we should acknowledge the fact that this case did not arise under the Constitution. In fact, it arose under a statute. And so it was kind of interesting to me. I don't know why exactly that happened, but essentially, if that is to happen, what you would do is, if there's a statute that you find might be unconstitutional because of whatever reason, it goes to court and it's, established either constitutional or unconstitutional. So in this case, when you actually look at the language of the statute, it pretty much mimics exactly what the First Amendment says. So I'm not exactly sure what approach the court took, but it seemed to me from what I read it was more about exercising the religious freedom of this corporate entity, which we've established can exercise it in that way.
Thank you for your question. Are there any others?
So I did want to clarify something that was said initially, I think that you read. And that was in regards to, well, if you don't agree with certain policies, you don't have to be a part of that organization. And I would disagree with that, mainly because if you give one party full authority to create certain kind of laws and policies, we can look at history and also human nature, and that will be abused. That blatant regard to just creating policy will be abused. And so that's why there are checks and balances in place, separation of powers, so on and so forth. So to say that I could run an organization and have discriminatory policies does not mean that I have the full right to do so, at least in this country, and that person should choose not to, choose to be discriminated against because they have the right to not choose to be a part of my organization. For instance, I grew up in Skokie, Illinois, and I had a lot of Orthodox Jewish friends actually, and I had a friend who she was Jewish, and she was a really talented player, but because of certain policies out there in the athletic world, but also some personal beliefs, she never pursued that route. And so it got me thinking, do we discriminate against women? Because, for instance, if I wore shorts and I was playing basketball and I got cuts and bruises, you could say, well, it's for the safety of your body that we do not allow you to wear shorts. So why is it that when a woman wants to cover her hair for her own safety, there's some, there's double standard. So I think that's where you really have to look at is where are some double standards? What is the intention behind the law of the policy? And and then hopefully remedy that.
Are there any other questions or need for clarification on anything?
I just wanted to clarify back to the Hobby Lobby thing. Their employee health care plan, I don't really know anything about healthcare, so I'm asking this, does not provide these for contraception, but Hobby Lobby is still paying their employees, and so it is their right with the money that they're receiving to buy these for contraception, which I think is your point, right?
That's exactly right. Not only do they have to buy them, they can get them at discounted costs at most clinics, like Planned Parenthood, around the country.
So I was thinking, kind of along the lines of a person who thinks that, well, I really wanted, this is really stretching it, but drink alcohol because that makes me feel relaxed. They're not going to pay for that, but with their own money, it is their right to buy the alcohol. So that's kind of what you were saying.
You got it.
Okay, I thought so, and then I got confused on that one, but thank you.
We're taught a lot, and I believe that ethics drives the law, that ethics is an extension of the law. And so if you were to draw a Venn diagram, the they would intersect but not be on top of each other. So I'm curious, really enjoyed hearing the panel's discussion today, what the relationship between ethics and religious beliefs is, because it's almost like I'm hearing that we're thinking in some of these cases that it's unethical to exercise their religious beliefs because it's affecting someone else, or if it's so I'm just curious what that relationship is to the panel, whoever may want to speak to that, between ethics and religion.
Yeah, I'll take a stab. I think that ethics, particularly from religion, drives, I use myself as an example, drives how I see things and how I look at things. The intersection between ethics and law is when I see something I think is ethically unjust, then I would act in whatever way I can to change that law or to point out that thing which I think is unethical. The problem is that what I think is unethical, other people think is ethical. To make it even more confusing, from my tradition, neither one of us is right, neither one of us is wrong. It's two perspectives that we're either going to find a compromise, which I think is where our law ends up most of the time, and compromise is taking no position, or we're going to keep wrestling with it. I think the problem I have is when ethics start driving things like public policy and politics and I would just say when religion comes into sort of the public discourse. It annoys me to no end when NFL players do their little prayer when they get in the end zone. That's where I'm bothered by ethics, because then there's a collective ethic, and I don't think that exists. I think there are, the Locke comment I think was terrific, if it hurts people, but even there, it's not clear. I had a conversation years ago with Harold Kushner. Actually, we were having breakfast, and great breakfast conversation. We were talking about postmodernism. I personally have a real hard time with that things have no inherent meaning, that it's what we make of it. And I went on and on and on about how I'm bothered by all this. And Rabbi Kushner said, yeah, I'll give you the argument why postmodernism doesn't work. He said, hurting people is bad. That was it. Now, is that an ethical position or is that a human position? I think it's a human position, but I could go to Africa and there are tribes where they still practice female infanticide, and they don't consider that hurting people. So it's just a moving target. I don't know if I made any clearer words. It was fun to say it. Fun to hear it.
Well, I thought for a second that I had the chance to just remain quiet, because I reached for the microphone thinking that no one else was going to say it. Rabbi Spiegel spoke, and apparently not getting out of it now. I think that historically the United States did emphasize on freedom of religious belief and freedom of assembly, and recognized from the outset that there were limitations to practice, because practice is where your practice may potentially affect others in ways that either infringes on their freedom or is felt to be contrary to the common good. And a case like the Hobby Lobby one is one where it's less than clear cut, right? I mean, where it's really at the edge of, if Hobby Lobby were officially recognized as a religious organization, there would be no question. There would, no one would, in fact, you can fire someone if they're not meeting your ethical standards, and if they actually have an abortion, that would be considered legal, because religious organizations have certain freedoms, as it were. It's because this is officially a secular, private company that it becomes less clear. And so we're always trying to balance different freedoms. One thing that I think is often forgotten is that within the biblical tradition, right, there are a lot of things in there which were laws, right? And we're used to viewing them as things that individuals can follow or not to follow, but we consider it appropriate for people to have the freedom to break the first or the first two, depending how you number them, commandments. Worshipping other gods. That's at the heart of religious freedom, right, that you'd be allowed to do that. Making images of, that's allowed too. And the penalty in biblical law for doing those things is death. We're not going to do that as a society. We've chosen the route of religious freedom. And some of us have actually made a religious case for that sort of freedom. But I think it's important to remember that many of our religious traditions originated in societies where the religion was closely connected with lawmaking and governance and things like that. And so in taking the approach that we're letting each person follow their own conscience, we're already violating biblical law in doing that. We're preserving the right of the individual to follow biblical law, but we're doing so in a way that is not in conformity with biblical law. And so that's the approach that we as a society have adopted, right, that allows, maximizes individual freedom, but prevents people, in particular, using the instruments of the state as a way of influencing others to believe. And that's a distinctively American approach, and other countries have very different approaches. And so I think it's also important to remember that there's no one way of approaching religious freedom that maximizes it. In some countries, you have a state church, and sometimes that state church is more tolerant than some churches in the United States. But also, we find that oftentimes those state churches are not doing particularly well, right? And so being state-funded and state-supported doesn't necessarily do good things to your religion or attendance or things like that. Religious freedom is very complex. And I think if there's something that I want people to take away from this evening, it's to remember that, in fact, it's not like, okay, we've got religious freedom, so now it's solved. We're making judgments about cases, and we're trying, hopefully, to be consistent, and we're often failing. And we're trying to explore and legislate and apply principles to boundaries where somebody's freedom is going to be affected detrimentally one way or the other. And we have to decide collectively whose and to what extent and in what ways.
In terms of the overlap between ethics, I think there is an overlap between ethics and law. We have to understand that ethics is not a perfect science, that it's been shifting. So for instance, what was ethically immoral a few years ago, 30 decades ago, is not going to be the case now, and hence why we look at cases to decide, well, what are the ethical boundaries, if you will, right now. And that's why when we look at these, we kind of are just looking at it as, wording from one amendment, but so the establishment of religion has its own separate set of checks and balances that the court will use. It's the Lemons test that's most, usually used, and it's a three-pronged analysis. The court will look at, well, is a policy, does it have a secular purpose? The second prong is there the primary effect of that policy to either advance or inhibit religion. So we're not just talking one end of the spectrum of, perpetuating some sort of religious behavior. We're also saying, well, does it inhibit some sort of behavior as well? And then the last prong is there government entanglement with the within the policy? And so if that policy, if the law doesn't satisfy the first prong, then it's unconstitutional. So you go through these different tests, and usually what's used to determine the second prong of this test is a reasonable person standard. I was shocked when I learned something like, so it's a reasonable person standard. And so these cases that come to the Supreme Court or whatever court in the state, The court essentially has to look at what would a reasonable person interpret with this case at hand. Right? And so that's how you do have subjectivity, because that's what the law, and I remember the first statement that I heard when I went to law school was, once you go to law school, you will never think of the world the same way. And I will tell you, it's so true, because everything depends now. Everything depends on something else. There is, and that's why I think, kind of to voice what you said earlier, in that it's complicated. It's not that, in fact, it's complicated, but it's also very simple in that we are kind of the individuals that determine how these laws are interpreted. We are the ones that determine what we deem constitutional and unconstitutional. So there's, it's an interesting journey.
All lawyers are Jews.
Many are.
Depends.
It depends.
It seems like education is the answer to this. What's the next steps for this religious paraphernalia issue that's going on? Whether it be a woman, wanting to cover her hair playing basketball, or individual wearing a turban in public settings without being discriminated.
So your question is, what is the next step?
Yeah, what's the next step?
Well, you challenge policies that you feel like are very discriminatory. And once again, it depends case by case. For instance, if a woman who wants to play for a very private league, and they have, because of their very strong beliefs, they say you can't cover your hair because of our personal beliefs as a private entity, private organization, then they're entitled to do so. I would have to say, sorry.
In a public setting, like a high school.
You challenge it. And it is challenged. So it happened in my own school actually in Southwest with the swim team. So it happens. It's sometimes it's surprising to know it happened in your locality, but you have to witness it to say, okay, I don't think that's constitutional. I think it's subjectivity. It's my interpretation versus somebody else's interpretation.
I mean, do you see that here in Butler?
Yeah, a little bit.
Okay,
Yeah.
then you have I don't want to speak for Butler as an institution, but you have the right to say something about it and see what that's all about and maybe make a change.
Yeah.
I don't know that we have the ability to change the woman's problem with playing basketball unless you want to create an organization that advocates for that. That whole thing about think globally, act locally.
My own feeling, apparently you get this really close, it works even better. Okay. My own feeling is that there are different sorts of cases. What the Constitution addresses is essentially what the federal government does. There's nothing that says that an organization which has a long-standing uniform, let's say, or basketball team, has to change that uniform to accommodate people's religious group. You could try and make that case. You could pursue that through the courts, but my own impression is that, in general, as a society, sometimes you see backlashes against that. You see ill will and things like that. And so probably the most important thing, I think, is to work as a society to get us to the point where most people, most reasonable people, agree that this is something that's important, right? That we're preventing people who have strongly held religious beliefs and religious dress codes from participating in sports, and then we might see a change. But I think that oftentimes if we can actively pursue sort of a grassroots movement in terms of change of opinion about these things, public opinion, teams will probably give the public what they want. And so oftentimes pursuing a change of a public opinion may be more effective in the long run than pursuing legal action to sort of force the team to change. Teams usually will do just about anything that people who buy tickets pay for things. Just like most corporations, I think, will do things. That says something about religious freedom. That, how much is religious freedom determined by where we'll spend our money and how we spend our money and things like that. But hopefully we can think of that as a separate issue. But yeah, personally, I think that trying to get a good proportion of the populace behind an issue is more likely to lead to lasting change that has widespread support. But that's my own personal perspective. I hope I'm not wrong about that if you follow my advice.
Yeah, I have one question, because you said a comment about NFL and praying. So recently there was a Muslim player that was penalized for praying after a touchdown, but then there's T-bowing, which is actually like a remembrance of God. So I was wondering, what is your opinion on like remembrance of God in a like setting of like sports or public place? Like what is your opinion?
Well, let me take a point of privilege. I think they have every right to do it. I just think it's silly. And that the Muslim player was singled out was wrong. Was just flat wrong. But you know, you talk about an unethical system in the NFL. And I was thinking, as Dr. James was talking. That works with any place other than the Washington Redskins. Now, there's obviously public backlash against them using the name, and they refuse. They've taken a stand. So I just want to be clear. I think it's silly, but they have every right to do it. Until the league decides you're not allowed to.
Are there any other questions?
I know that Dr. McGrath, you touched on this a little bit earlier, but what are some of maybe the parallels between scriptural law and the law that's set in place in America
I think that at a fundamental level, they're very different. Now, arguably, certainly, particularly for those who have other later testaments that has a history of coming about and coming into existence within a context in which those who were writing them were a religious minority, and so were hoping for the goodwill of the government and things like that, and didn't have either freedom of religion or really recourse. There's a somewhat different approach to things there. So depending on what your scriptures are, even within the biblical tradition, you may have different resources that you're working with. But ultimately, there's nothing within Scripture that Christian Scripture or Jewish and Christian Scripture that really advocates freedom of religion. And so the very fact that we've adopted that is in tension at least. Right? It's not necessarily at odds with, although you could make that case, but it's at the very least in tension with the biblical literature's legal tradition in particular, which legislated that grind idols to dust. If someone tries to lead you to worship other gods, let your hand be the one that reaches out and takes the sword to them. Show them no mercy. That's almost diametrically opposed to the approach of adopting religious freedom. Yeah. In relation to the earlier question, I wondered whether there was undue religious bias in referring to a Hail Mary pass. Is that favoring one tradition? I don't know. Yeah, there are all these issues that come up.
A point of information, I disagree. There is scriptural evidence for freedom of religion. In Judaism, it's not just the Bible. The Talmud is actually more authoritative for us than the Bible. The Bible says do this, but it doesn't say how. The Talmud, which is this hundreds of years collection of the how-to. And it is case law. It is a collection of case law. And many say that that's where the Western system of law comes from. In my predecessors, 2,000 years ago, I would have been a judge and or a lawyer, arguing cases, which I find is funny. But it is very clear, it doesn't say in the Talmud that we have to give religious freedom, but it is very clear that other religions exist and they have every right to exist. There is no exclusivity among any religions. And
tolerance, actually, there's a whole section on business ethics. Violating business ethics against non-Jews, the punishment is more severe than with Jews. So it's very much addressed. It's not in the Bible for us. It's in the other stuff, which we actually consider more important, but nobody ever reads.
Can I address the issue as well? What Scripture usually speaks of as the second table of the law, the commandments 4 through 10, depending again, as Dr. McGrath said, on numbering, typically summed up in love your neighbor as yourself, right? Is also understood from the Christian perspective as being natural law. It is ingrained upon the heart and conscience. Christians and non-Christians agree that it is unethical, or you left, to kill, right? That's just not good for a society, and so on down the line. The framers of the Constitution, for example, our founding fathers, most of them were deists and not Christians, understood that this natural law was, how do we say it? How do they say it in the preamble? We are endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights, rights that cannot be taken away because they don't emerge from us but are given by a higher authority, right? Those overlap quite significantly with Christian ethics, with Christian morality, with law, and as we speak of it in that sense, not Old Testament Judaism, which was a theocracy, of course, which America is not. So they understood that within that purview, something that may be of assistance to you, you see taking notes, you might be interested in a book by Alvin Schmidt called How Christianity Changed the World. And you see that under these things that nations that were not Christian but allowed for the free establishment of religion and Christianity flourished, you see the rise of modern mathematics, science, humanitarian aid and care, hospitals, universities, etc. This university, right? That flourishes under what Christians recognize as natural law, which is a close caveat to God speaks that outside of us, confirming what we already know internally.
If I might give the response from a sociological or anthropological perspective, where do we find these natural rights? In my view, these notions of inalienable rights, they derive from argumentation, to go back to the rabbi's comment. They derive from consensus. Thou shalt not kill, right? We all agree that's a natural right. Well, no, it's not. I can kill if I'm a soldier. I can kill if you've done something and you deserve the death penalty. Maybe I can kill in self-defense. Maybe I'm allowed to kill if I'm threatened by somebody I don't recognize in my neighborhood, if I'm in Florida. What does that precisely mean? Thou shalt not kill. Well, Christians have developed a whole theory of just war that says in these situations you may kill. There is no consensus. You say thou shalt not kill. There is no natural law. It's not there. These things derive from consensus, not from belief. We fight about them. We argue about them. We have panels like this about them. We spend our time debating them. Eventually, a consensus of 50.5% emerges, and we make a law. But we can't say that those derive, in my view, from any kind of original natural law. There is no such thing from a sociological or anthropological perspective. These things derive from contestation, and only after.
And I would posit it's probably a misinterpretation of the Hebrew. It says lo tirtzah, which does not mean kill. It's really more akin to murder. So that throws the whole thing out of whack.
If I may also chime in. So we've got Canaan law, and it seems like there's also Sharia law, and people are like, well, it's just backward law system, and it's because all of these laws are subject to interpretation and misinterpretation. And I think going back to, I would agree with Chad in that when you are interpreting it is by a process of consensus, and ethics come into play, and people's tribal practices come into play, and so on and so forth. And so there is definitely law, and then there's interpretation of law, and you cannot have, if you only have law, for instance, this is a good example of how laws can be misunderstood or, debated on, just like, you will see a similar situation like canon law and religious laws, because it's humans trying to interpret something.
Are any other questions? Well, thank you all for coming. Please get some more people on the way out.